Paul Daly, welcome back to the Business of Betting podcast.
Jake, great to be back, and thank you very much for taking the time out to have me on.
You're welcome. It's May 2017 was the last time we spoke. You were one of the very first to come on to the podcast, and back then it was probably a very big risk in your career to chat on a podcast, which was pretty new, and now it's fun to come back around 3 years later and dig into some more betting topics, more horse racing. You've done a lot in that time, and we'll get stuck into some of that now.
Yeah, well, great, Jake. I mean, I'm looking forward to it. And look, some of the content you've produced over the last few years is astounding, and heard from people that I didn't even know existed in the various industries. And some of the guests you've obviously had back for a second time. It's a good refresh.
Absolutely. So tell us what's been happening the last couple of years. I know we talked a fair bit about the database ratings to win and what was going on there. Has that evolved much over the years? I'm guessing it has. Tell us some of the high-level points that people might be interested in hearing.
Well, look, there's been a lot of growth in terms of the features and functionality that we continue to invest and put into the database. And obviously clients get that benefit at no extra cost. But those ideas, thankfully, come from not only clients, but ourselves in terms of our long-range planning and what we've wanted to do. There's been some industry first features that we've certainly included, which we obviously take advantage of, and that just continues. And that's really, I suppose, the mantra that we've tried to live by from the start, and that is have a small, quality client base that you can interact with and get to know, and continue to bounce ideas and get fed ideas on development. And I suppose now our program schedule is still about 18 months into the future.
So I spoke to James Willoughby a little bit about data, and I think total performance data as well, about what they're doing. And it's an interesting topic because it's often one that gets raised, sectional times especially, and how that information is disseminated within the industry, especially in a wagering context. Just tell us, from your point of view and perspective, what's that world like when it comes to what you're trying to do, and obviously downstream to the audience that you have and the people that are using that information to bet? Is it a fragmented and fractured system, as it sounds like, or are there things that we're missing in this discussion?
Look, I think it is fragmented in the sense that you've got different providers offering different data. There is no one constant. You tend to pay a lot of money to get quality data, and look, I think that punters overall often have tools at their disposal that they don't really understand. So it's all very well saying, well, I've got all these sectional times to play with, but you've got to know how to interpret the data and gain an edge from it. And really, if you're not doing something different to what everyone else is doing, then you're really going to not see any advancement in your own betting in terms of profitability and whatnot as a result. So for us, I mean, having things like all the wides at every 200-metre point for every race in Australia and Hong Kong, and knowing whether or not they're with cover or no cover, and that includes country racing, that can certainly be data that's useful for punters and time saving, as well as margins from the leader at every 200-metre point throughout the racing, including some early speed data. So that obviously goes back into things like speed maps and whatnot. So when you're analysing a meeting post-race, you can take advantage of having that data in front of you and ascertaining things like bias and whether or not there's particular lanes that are better or worse, or whether horses outperformed relative to their price and whatnot. And so that's an important part of the ratings process and gaining an edge over and above just what collateral ratings might offer.
Where do times rank in the hierarchy of importance? And maybe it's evolved, but from your clients and what you're doing, is it in the top, couple, and without sectional times that are accurate, you're way behind, or is it something that it varies by punter?
Look, from my point of view, selfishly, I think it's great that the industry doesn't actually do much with sectional times, insofar as the timing equipment used is different depending on which area you go to. A lot of the systems aren't well maintained. They're not very accurate. for the most part. So there's obviously a marketplace for accurate sectional times, and that's being filled by various players in different formats. But for me personally, I mean, times and sectionals are a huge part of the equation. I mean, we all started off with basically weight ratings as they were back in the Scott era, and for a long time there, people tended to factor weight ratings over and above times because the timing availability just wasn't there. But going back even into the 80s and 90s, when there were a number of professional teams or individual punters who actually had staff, recording times and filming barrier trials and clocking them and getting the advantage from it, a lot of that's obviously disappeared. But when I'm rating a race and doing what I call the back form, which is essentially assigning a race quality figure to races that have been run in order to create a historical rating for each horse's performance, the times and sectionals are a very important part of that process.
What do you think the wagering space especially would look like if we had sectional times gathered properly and accurately and disseminated widely, even something in the typical newspaper form, the best bets form, or online, free form that widely covered that, and some of the things you're talking about was freely available, where you can talk about cover, no cover, lanes, and these types of things?
Well, you can provide the information, but as I sort of tried to allude to before, you've got to know what to do with it. And if you can't actually take that data and create an offshoot that's going to be a value add to whatever model or process you're using to create your market estimates in the first place, then I don't really see the point. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there that you see on different websites and average times and average speeds and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't really mean much unless you've got an understanding of what it is that you're actually looking for and what you're trying to do with what you get a hold of. I mean, certainly it would benefit the industry, I think, as a whole, but there are lots of other things that I think we need to sort of resolve in a betting sense and as an industry in order for the industry to continue to prosper in Australia.
Have you found the market catching up to some horses that you might find based on some sectional time related interpretations? And I remember talking to Dean Evans about it when he was talking about trials, and back in the day he was saying he would find one of the trials and it might be 40s and he was the only one in the world that knew about it potentially, or one of very, very few. Is sectional timing like that, where you might find one that you love and it might be $6 and you're the only one backing it? Or is it now where there might be a handful of people, and instead of starting $6, it might be $3.50, and it might get bet into in the twos, for example?
I was going to say that your 5-1 chance of 15 years ago might be 5-2 today. So a lot of that value in horse racing has left us. But there are different ways to skin the cat, and you've got to continue to revisit what you're doing. And look at the inputs that you're presented with, and it's not so much that the fundamentals have changed; it's the weighting of all the variables that changes, and the market continues to refine and get smarter, and obviously price things more accurately in one area, but then perhaps expose a hole somewhere else. Dean's a great judge, and he uses our database as a result of trying to, I suppose, produce his trial service and to isolate those horses that have done very well. And look, trials is really an art, and you've got to be a specialist at it, I think, to do well, and that's what he does. That's just one area that you can, I suppose, apply yourself to get benefit. There are lots of others, specialisation in particular geographical areas, and horse pills is another.
Paul, what drives you to do all this? We can talk about the betting, we can talk about the database, and you're talking about programming 18 months ahead. You've probably got well thought out plans and devised ways to make sure all your clients are happy long into the future, and Hong Kong and all the other things we're going to talk about today and we have previously. But what drives you to continue keeping up all these different aspects, and why not specialize on one, for example?
Well, personally, I do, or try to. I mean, the Australian market is a great product, and it needs to be sort of obviously worked on in order to maintain it. There's lots of problems in all markets and all products that you see on offer, but you've got to sort of zoom in on what you're passionate about and what you love doing. And being a very exact person by nature, uh, the puzzle and the challenge, I suppose, is what continues to motivate me. My work ethic has always been very high. I would probably most days spend no less than maybe 14 hours doing what I love. And as long as I continue to enjoy it, I'll keep doing it. And I can't see that that's going to reduce anytime soon.
So let's talk a little bit about the betting side. Obviously, the landscape is shifting, or has anyway, over the last 18, 24 months, certainly since we last spoke. How does it impact your world? Obviously, it may come in different shapes and sizes given what you're touching, but just from an Australian racing point of view first, how do you see it? Is it generally trending in one direction? Is it something that really has an impact, or are you still able to navigate it pretty easily?
Okay, so personally, up until recently, when COVID hit, I live in Brisbane. I was flying to Sydney twice a week and spending time there, but back in Brisbane, sort of splitting my time, I suppose, equally, and betting in the ring down there because of the attraction of the competitive markets in Sydney on offer, and also the fact that rails bookmakers have to bet you larger limits than what you can obtain through minimum bet laws. So it's practice that a rails bookmaker in Sydney has to bet you to lose 5,000 on a Saturday, and you've got a few outer bookmakers or paddock bookmakers that bet you to lose a couple of thousand. But of course, you can have more than one bite of the cherry, which is a problem that punters have when they're betting with corporates. You can tend to only back the horse once. The prices that you're betting into aren't competitive. I mean, the markets are sort of structured, in that 130% range quite often, and that obviously makes it very difficult for a punter to get any value. The problem is that you don't have a cohesive minimum bet law strategy that's being embraced by all of the principal racing authorities. I mean, we've still got WA without any minimum bet laws. You've got different states with different amounts. For example, if you're betting on Brisbane racing and you go to the racetrack, the bookmakers can actually restrict you to win $500, which is ridiculous when you think about it. So there's been a lot of work done by people like Richard Irvine, and I suppose as punters we've got to thank him for what he's done and the service he's put in over the years in making sure that continues to be stimulated. But the problem is you've got all these different agendas from principal racing authorities. You've got the tote market gradually consolidating. We've had the takeover of UBet in Queensland by Tabcorp. So we've got Tabcorp Queensland now. There's lots of talk about a national pool, but there's obviously some obstacles with respect to that. And plus, you pretty much have an uncompetitive tote product as it is. New bet types haven't sort of delivered on some of their promises and what they've hoped for in terms of things like Racing New South Wales odds and evens and whatnot. I mean, that's been an abject failure. So I think the things to go forward, I mean, punters have obviously got to keep fighting the fight, and you've got to have operators, in Australia, I suppose you've got the likes of Top Sport who are very competitive and, at least trying to give punters a go. And you've got Bet Easy leaving the marketplace, and so you've had consolidation amongst the corporate ranks, and so it continues to get tougher, and the avenues for punters aren't what they once were.
It strikes me as problematic that a resident of Queensland, let's say, needs to head down to Sydney to be able to essentially operate a business, and obviously you're looking pretty closely and heavily at Hong Kong as well. And if Racing Queensland were to address this topic, how do you think they would feel, or what do you think they would say if one of their residents has to basically get on a plane twice a week and also look internationally for a viable option for them?
Well, look, I've sat down with previous management of Brisbane Race Club, for instance. In fact, with a CEO or previous CEO, who basically said that they don't care about punters. They're more interested in selling alcohol and the party atmosphere. That's where they make the money, and the gambling is not really their focus. When you've got people that think like that running racing clubs, what hope is there? The fact that they were able to introduce a minimum bet law of to win $500 on course for a bookmaker in any state, it's pathetic. I mean, it's inconceivable that anyone can think that that's good for racing. You don't actually have people in those positions focused on wagering or even aware, perhaps, of what's actually required in a wagering sense to promote the good of the sport and the industry as a whole. And so I think that there has to be some drastic changes in regard to that. But, to answer your question, I don't think Brisbane Racing or anyone involved in Brisbane Racing would care that, someone has to actually travel to another state to bet. They're not interested.
What has COVID presented? And obviously, there's plenty of discussion about the impact of COVID, but what about opportunities? Has it changed the wagering pools at all? Has it had an impact in your mind when you are betting, in the Sydney Ring, for example, or when you are betting online? Has it had additional coverage that might be positive and things like that?
Well, I mean, for me personally, I've moved my betting into a different space, and we're going to talk about that. I'm still betting in Australia on an automated basis for much smaller money. So it's a sort of a turnover and low margin model, which is not ideal and not really what I wanted to do, but it's become necessary. Look, I think for some people, like, in-play traders, they've probably seen some advantage as a result of, crowds not being at the racetrack, and so they've, seen more error or more opportunity in those markets. How long that lasts for, I don't know. There's obviously a cost to all of this in terms of the COVID business. I mean, we saw that EI in Australia, produced a scenario whereby, a lot of punters were lost to the industry, or if you like, the punters who used to go to the track were lost to the industry post EI. And, some much smarter people than me have sort of suggested that it's going to be similar this time around, and there's really not that many more people to go.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about Hong Kong. And I guess from the outset, why Hong Kong? What was the impetus? Why was it a requirement? Like we talked about a little bit before, being a Queensland resident, take us through some of the thought process to get to the ability to pull the trigger, essentially.
Well, look, I mean, a brief history summary is that I intended doing something like this a number of years ago, and I worked in conjunction with a few guys, and we looked at doing something in respect of Hong Kong. And when it came time to pull the trigger, their capital requirements or requirements to inject capital had changed, and they had other financial commitments that were more important. So that didn't really go anywhere at the time. I traded the most part of the 16-17 season myself with very limited success. I made, truthfully about 0.8 or 1%, which was certainly nothing to write home about. But what I did learn during that time was the differences in the Hong Kong structure of racing, and the fact that you've actually got to do form differently and weight things differently to be able to bet successfully into that Hong Kong market. But the attractiveness of the huge pools and obviously the liquidity and the rebates and other things that, obviously, there are lots of punters who fit that space and bet in syndicates and groups and whatnot. The lure of that was obviously something that I couldn't resist.
So tell me what took place post that season you just mentioned, for example, to today. What type of diligence were you doing? Were you looking into, the previous history of Hong Kong? Were you looking into Bill Benter and Alan Woods, or were you looking more recently? Were you looking at purely your own results and your own trading and your own form process, for example? Tell us what it takes to transition from back then to now so that you can basically have more success.
Well, we started building the Hong Kong database around about 2009-10. So that's the seedlings, if you like, of where we are now. At the time, we didn't really know why we were collecting this data, other than we had a vague idea that we'd like to do something with it one day. So we continued to obviously collect and correct and verify that data as we went along, and gradually added new aspects and new components to it. to what we have today. So the database journey in the context of Hong Kong was sort of a story in itself. What I started with was really just I suppose, the fact that we've got some races here, and this is what the class system is, and this is what the basics are about Hong Kong. Obviously, a smaller pool of horses was attractive from a modelling point of view. Limited jockeys, limited trainers, limited tracks, a very structured handicapping system and a merit-based handicapping system was attractive from my point of view. And so it was just a matter of, figuring out, how this puzzle actually works. And in order to do that, there's lessons that can be learnt, and those lessons are well learnt when you actually risk some of your own capital in doing so. So that was a process, I suppose, that we go through, or we went through, and since then, of course, it's evolved. I walked out of Rosehill, was Coolmore Stakes Day, I think the last meeting when COVID happened, and that was it. I sort of sat back and thought, well, what am I going to do? And it didn't take me long to sort of put the Hong Kong priority, if you like, at the top of the list, and just make a firm commitment to do something about it.
How difficult have you found it to essentially reprogram your thinking about racing to apply it properly to Hong Kong? Because it's something that is often really difficult, and especially the curse of having decades of experience in a country or a jurisdiction isn't always great when you need to be adaptable and agile for a different jurisdiction. Was that something you struggled with, or was that something that took some time? And even just a very simple example, I remember when people would say that it's better to have an outside gate in a 1,000-meter race, for example, because if you have some speed, you can cross the field pretty easily. It was always growing up that best to have gate 1, 2, 3, 4 in any race, and just reprogramming your mind in certain situations can be challenging. What was it like for you in this aspect?
Well, look, a couple of things about what you're saying there. You're right. I mean, having prior knowledge, as it were, in terms of the process of doing form on Australian racing is actually a handicap in itself when you go to Hong Kong. There's certain things that you can take from it, sure, but I think that there is a lot to be said for someone, starting out from scratch and spending the time and learning the ropes, as it were, which takes, several years to get right. And I don't think you ever actually stop learning. I mean, even to this day, I'm still researching angles and, looking at different aspects of what I do, and always, if you like, analysing my betting performance post-meeting and looking at what I did well and what I didn't do so well and what I can improve upon. But I think that that's what any successful punter does. For me, I suppose it wasn't, the opportunity was a bit different insofar as I wasn't trying to build a mathematical model that would operate on high volume and controlling my losses and just picking up a rebate. It was more about, I want to do this well. I want to do the form as well as I possibly can. So it's a very manual process that still takes maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours a race to do it properly on average. You've got obviously a certain controlled number of races, which is an advantage, but doing the form well is the priority. And I suppose not only are your results important, but your final prices in terms of where the market ends up, what you think that they're going to do.
Can you share a little bit about your thoughts on the rebates as they apply to Hong Kong and just how it impacts your thinking? And obviously with being a fund manager of sorts, let's say, it's obviously a topic you need to address and consider. You touched on a little bit about those that might be looking for a strategy of avoiding the potholes, break-even betting, and collecting rebates is potentially one aspect or one path to go down. Tell us about some of the history of rebates, how it impacted your thought process, and what ultimately you decided to do.
Well, look, and I'm only talking about Hong Kong here. I mean, the betting markets in Hong Kong, based on some research that I've done, showed that from the 80s onwards, horse racing revenue in Hong Kong grew exponentially. It was a very fluid market, obviously not what it is today, but post the handover of Hong Kong from British rule and the Asian financial crisis, which was about 97, I think, the revenue from horse racing started to decline. Now, that was in concert a few years later, or several years later, when the Jockey Club actually was granted a license to, if you like, bookmake on football, and the revenue from that saw, some of that money being redistributed into football and the racing itself declining. I mean, there was also the lottery business, or is the lottery business that they have there as part of that turnover, but that's sort of a fairly constant from what I understand. So, horse racing started to show signs of regression in terms of the revenue that they were getting from the turnover, and the Hong Kong club decided to introduce a rebate scheme in or about 2006, and that sort of arrested the problem. Historically, when we look back through the looking glass, that has arrested the problem, and the market has grown from what it was at the time, which was probably around about $60 or $70 billion a year in turnover, to well over 120 odd billion back in the I think 17-18 season. I don't have the latest figures, but it's certainly shown to be successful, and I believe that something similar in Australian racing could work, but it would require the cooperation of all the principal racing authorities and tabs and whatnot in order to make it work. And I think that is in itself the problem that will prevent it happening. But that was the attraction, I suppose, is learning about the rebates and understanding what it all meant and how some of these models operated. And obviously I did research on Benter and Woods and whatnot, and sort of got a bit of an idea of how they were operating. But that seems to be what the marketplace is in Hong Kong. It's largely set by the mathematicians. They're really just trying to control their losses. They're not actually trying to be a net winner before the rebate.
So rebates is often a negative term. It's something that potentially might be market to market, it sounds like. From a Hong Kong perspective, it sounds like you believe it might have been net positive for the overall marketplace from a betting landscape perspective.
Well, it absolutely has been. If you look at the success of what the club's done in terms of arresting the decline in turnover. Interestingly, though, those rebates, Jake, are available to anyone betting on Hong Kong Jockey Club tote pools. The only condition is the minimum bet that's required before you actually access the rebate. So it's not a rebate, for some but not all. It's a rebate for all.
Yeah, interesting. And I think that's certainly an interesting topic, because there's plenty of discussions, and we even touched on it briefly earlier with the Australian landscape and even other parts of the world with how they arrest what's going on with the global nature of betting, and just yourself, being a resident of Queensland, heading down to Sydney to bet in the ring, obviously focusing on Hong Kong. Just in that short example there, you can see how the distribution of wagering funds is being dispersed in different jurisdictions, and that obviously is, if I was an administrator, which I certainly am not, would be something I'd be worried about, especially if someone on my doorstep is finding ways to get out of my jurisdiction.
Well, yeah. I mean, and the industry's answer to that was, in part, the introduction of the Interactive Gaming Act, where they were trying to prevent the flow of funds out of Australian sports betting and racing to illegal offshore operators, and so they obviously introduced that legislation as one of the measures that they hoped would prevent that from flourishing, and I suppose it has had an effect. But realistically, that's not the problem. The problem is inherently internal, and they need to do something about the system. The system's broken.
Yeah, it strikes me as on the back foot and being defensive. Fighting off those operators that are potentially attractive for anyone in a jurisdiction to go offshore or look internationally. And if you just keep being defensive and fighting off, then ultimately someone's probably going to defeat you at some point, or if not, it's going to be a slow death. But just in terms of Hong Kong, what does it take to get something like this off the ground? It strikes me as there's a lot of admin, there's a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of things to think through, I'm guessing a lot of things have popped up along the way that you might not have expected from the outset. Were there any major obstacles or hurdles to get it done, or have overall you found it to be a task worth going through the process on and getting off the ground?
Well, look, from my own point of view, I suppose it grew out of necessity because there's a certain percentage of my my betting that is rebatable, as it were now, but a lot of it is not, simply because of the fact that you've got to achieve that minimum loss target, as it were, on a ticket to be able to qualify for the rebate. So my thinking behind this was to say, well, if we do this, then I'm able to effectively increase the percentage of my own bets that qualify for the rebate. And that's obviously an important financial consideration, and it goes into the makeup of if you like, revenue that's achieved from betting. So, yeah, it was important to make that one of the priorities, but not just for myself, but somehow bring this together for a small group of other players, as it were, to benefit from. And so it made sense that we put together essentially an unregistered managed investment scheme. And obviously there's legal hurdles and whatnot that have to be overcome in doing all of that. And we sought legal advice and, in fact, have my lawyer as one of the participants, as it were, in all of this. And there was a fair bit of admin and hard work and pushing to get things done. But what we're trying to do, I suppose, Jake, is put together a bit of an interactive experience for the people involved, so that they know what all the bets are before the race. They get to cheer them home. There's full disclosure. There's full transparency. And effectively our success is aligned because of my own personal involvement in the trade fund itself, in as so much as I've invested considerable amounts of money myself to ensure that it is successful.
So you haven't gone down the typical hedge fund path of 1 or 2% of net assets and 15-20% of profits?
No. It's different to that. I mean, as it stands as of today, I mean, there's been a couple of things that the Jockey Club have announced, like the increase in rebates that will apply to Quinella and Quinella place bets in the new season, which is obviously great for anyone that participates and plays in that space. For us, we also achieved the milestone of what I was hoping to achieve. We put together $1 million pool, which will be employed or deployed, as it were, at the start of the new season. The people that we've got involved are people that I know and are clients of my own and associates that I deal with, and obviously people close to the Ratings to Win brand. And so, we've pretty much, I suppose, well and truly overachieved what we wanted to see at this point in time. So we're all closed. We're full. In terms of the opportunity, we're excited by it. We've completed or virtually completed the building of an app, which will essentially deliver the information to the players in real time prior to the race, so that they're fully involved in the outcomes. And the reporting, as I said, flows into that as being one of the, I suppose, important details of knowing that, this is what we're all doing and this is what we're all working towards. So, yes, the rubber, if you like, for us is that we get a management fee out of profits, but that management fee is quite reasonable and quite low compared to maybe some other operators in the marketplace. But it's not about so much making money from this as a trade fund. It's more about the fact that the majority of our bets will then qualify for this rebate.
Yeah, and I think it says a lot that you are in the fund yourself. You have the skin in the game, to steal a term from Taleb, and it'll be you'll be riding the ups and downs as much as anyone. Just to follow up on what you were talking about there, tell us about the appetite from your target investors, the target audience. It sounds like it was really positive, which may be a surprise given the world as it is today. But overall, is it something that people want to have exposure to in general, the Hong Kong markets?
I think so. And look, I went in thinking, well, our target was to reach a group of 20 people, excluding myself. As a director, I'm not counted in the requirement the exemptions that we're looking for under the Corporations Act. But essentially, we had a $25,000 Australian buy-in minimum. I always anticipated that I'd put in at least $250 into the fund, which I did to begin with, but it grew very quickly, and really in the space of maybe 5 or 6 days, it was pretty much full in terms of the numbers. And we've had some top-ups from existing clients that have decided to increase their involvement, not only as a result of today's announcement, but just in terms of, perhaps their initial commitments that they'd made, had some flexibility in them, and they've been able to see themselves towards increasing that. So, look, we couldn't have hoped for a better start.
Tell us a little about the application of your betting strategy. You don't have to go into detail in what the strategy actually is, but more so about how actually it'll operate. And obviously people and I've been following from afar, but I think Betfair dabbled in Hong Kong for a brief moment. What are the options available to you? How do you have to think about setting it up? Are there any obstacles in that process and in that approach, or is it relatively simple on the betting execution side to get it all done?
Look, we have our own in-house trading platform as such that allows us to gather, data from the pools and price information that is obviously then used in conjunction with some math to ascertain, where the value bets lie in the actual pools as we see them. We're betting very late into the actual betting of a race, so it might be that we're betting right down to the minute mark or so, and those bets are then obviously put into the tote pools. We're targeting mainly Quinella pools. That's the largest pool in Hong Kong, and there's a fair degree of recreational money that sits in those pools, and perhaps that's the reason why they are so much a target of some of these bigger syndicates. Look, I think the win pool in Hong Kong is very pure. There's not a lot of price bias, as you would get, say, in an Australian market, on long shots. So there's probably, not a huge value in the actual win pool itself, as it were. But certainly, there are fixed odds avenues that some of the bookmakers in Australia offer, the corporates and whatnot, and we're doing some work in that space to try and shore up some the ability for the fund to trade with one of these corporates for a certain minimum, so that we can at least target some of the value in some of the early prices that they offer, which are obviously incorrect in terms of where the SPs end up.
So more generally, have you found that, or what type of efficiency do you find in Hong Kong in the prices and the overall starting prices compared to somewhere like Australia? And I guess some of the nuance you've talked about with potentially syndicates looking at it from a different perspective, trying to just sort of break even betting and maybe have a different thought process and approach, whereas other markets it may not be the same given the rebate structure and the overall pool structure. Have you found Hong Kong to be pretty spot on when it comes to the prices and the pools, or is there room to move when it comes to the efficiency?
Well, look, the efficiency of the Hong Kong market is something I first looked at probably around 2012, and I found even then there was very little, if you like, error in the final prices in the win pools. In Australia, people may or may not know that there's a fair degree of price bias, or favourite long shot bias, as we would call it, that exists in the actual final prices. Look, the SP is still a great guide, but for people backing long shots, your 10-1 might be a 14-1 chance, and your 25-1 might be a 40 or 50-1 chance, and whatnot. But your $1.50 chance is pretty much bang on $1.50. So there's obviously advantages for punters who are playing at the pointier end of the market in Australia. That's still pretty much an underbet space for whatever reason. But in Hong Kong, it's different. The prices are pretty accurate. And some recent research that I've done on the market there really shows that what I did back in 2012 hasn't changed all that much. There's certainly been some movement in some of the other pools, which I probably won't go into too much detail on. But that in itself is the advantage.
Do you think longer term Hong Kong could be a primary market for you as opposed to betting into the Australian markets, or is this something you're going to assess as you go and see what evolves?
Oh, look, I think with everything, Jake, you've got to take it as it comes. But look, I mean, Hong Kong have grown their market, year on year for quite some time now, and it certainly is the domain for some of the biggest teams, the computer teams in horse racing to bet in. There are obviously other markets that we're looking at exploring, and perhaps in time we can do that. But for now, I'm very passionate about what I'm doing with Hong Kong in terms of the form that I'm doing there and the results that we're getting. So for me at this stage, I can't see that changing in the short term at least.
So I wanted to ask you very generally about new entrants coming to betting markets in racing, especially, and certainly in Australia. Given you have different touch points within the industry and your finger on the pulse, tell me a little bit about 20-something-year-olds coming into racing, what avenue they can take to get involved. They don't necessarily need to start day one and jump in and subscribe to a database necessarily, but what are the avenues that do exist? Because I talk to a lot of people in the industry, and oftentimes it's not a 24-year-old that's dedicating a lot of their time to horse racing and wagering pools. Do you see any growth in that area, or is it as it sounds, and it may not be something that we're going to see, and there might be a bit of a gulf in that range, or age range, I should say?
Look, I think that's where we'd like to see some growth in Australia, but perhaps the boat's sailed somewhat already with regards to a lot of those players. I mean, there are obviously new people coming into the space, and we're doing our best as an industry, I suppose, and to attract them. There's certainly a lot of information available. There wasn't much available when I started out, and it was pretty much buy Don Scott's book and read and learn and read and learn and practice and do things yourself and try out different things and perhaps go onto some of the websites, look at some of the racing services that are available to learn from. I mean, we've got people like Mark Lambourne who operate Racing Rant, who's very much got a Sydney focus, but there's some great lessons to be learnt there and some great information that they provide for punters wanting to enter the space. I think that if I had to give myself some advice as a young 20-something-year-old now, looking back, I'd certainly be targeting a lot of the information and education that's available, through podcasts like yours, Jake, and others that are on the market. Listen to as much as you can, read as much as you can, and research as much as you can. And if you're not prepared to sort of commit, a decent chunk of whatever spare time you've got, then I think you're going to find it tough to survive. I mean, the market's moved very much towards a tipster style model where people, all over Twitter and social media and whatnot are offering tips for sale and whatnot. And I think that's probably got a limited lifespan myself. But look, it's a challenge, and it's hard to know exactly what to do. But that's probably what I'd recommend any young person wanting to enter the industry do is, read as much as you can, learn, ask questions, subscribe to some of these services, learn yourself, do things yourself, make mistakes, and just commit to it as a long-term project. I mean, it's certainly an industry that provides great challenges for all involved.
What is the information sharing like between people in your networks? Is it only those that are, close friends, for example, that will share different things with you? Because obviously you mentioned Mark and what he's done over the years has certainly clearly helped a lot of people. And even I think I spoke to Darren Potter about his story, and he had spent a lot of time watching the old Punters show and all the way through to Racing Rant, and now, does what he does. Is there a lot of information available if you're willing to ask and you're willing to listen, or is it still something that is closely guarded and people might not be willing to spurt out all the great ideas that they have?
No, not at all. I mean, I think there's lots of information out there, and there's a very willing cohort of people, offering information up and sharing information of all sorts. As I said, on social media and through other various media forms, podcasts and whatnot. So, I think, what probably took me maybe 10 years to learn, nowadays you could probably learn in 2. So there's certainly some advantages in starting out now. I know myself, I've taken on a number of projects or proteges, if you like, in terms of clients of Ratings to Win and the database and so forth, and worked with a number of clients and been able to, either turn their betting around into something that's more profitable, or certainly turn them from losing punters into winning punters. And that's part of what my journey that I've enjoyed doing and continue to do with some, good long-term clients that have been with us from the start, who are very committed in not only supporting our brand, but helping other people as well along the way. People, as I said, like Mark Lambourne and Darren Potter and Dean Evans and whatnot. I mean, these are just some of the names that are out there. There's just so many now.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of great information if you are willing to search. So tell us, can we follow along through the app and see how the results go and things like that, or is that closed to those participants and maybe we have to wait until next time?
Yeah, look, I mean, we certainly intend to put some performance figures up after the fund ceases. I mean, each fund goes for 23 weeks in duration, so essentially half the season. But the bets and the live data that people will be getting is obviously to players only for a number of reasons. But we'll be keeping that to ourselves in the short term. But certainly, as the results start to flow, we'll post that, and that'll be available for all to see who are interested. Existing players who are in this fund will obviously get first right of refusal on the next, and we'll just take it one at a time for now and see how we go. And who knows, there could be some growth in this space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this fund is called Hoi Sheng, or I've probably butchered that, but I think it means to win. So hopefully that's the result.
Yes.
And hopefully
that's what we're aiming for, Jake.
And hopefully bigger and better next time, and then onwards and upwards.
Indeed. And look, at the end of the day, I mean, we've put some budget numbers together, and we think overall they're pretty conservative and achievable. But look, I mean, people have got to remember, this is like any form of investment or risk taking or gambling. There's obviously always going to be some variance, and average returns are indeed average, and they sometimes take time to materialise.
Indeed. Paul, thank you very much for your time. It's always a pleasure chatting. Hopefully it's not 3 years until we get to do this again.
Indeed. Thanks very much, Jake. And once again, I think it's terrific what you're doing, and keep up the great work.